So, so thanks for everybody for logging in. Um, Last week we talked about the 1850s and how it was just, I think, it must have been just a crazy time leading up to what they didn't know it at the time, but leading up to the Civil War in 1861. Um, Nadia and Toto Lope, what did we discuss last week? What were some of the topics?
We
I'm
discussed.
sorry, I could not hear I could not hear the question well.
Oh, last week, what did we discuss?
Bleeding Kansas?
Yeah, Bleeding Kansas, right. So why was Kansas so violent? What's the story there? Do you remember?
I think it. Okay, I'll wait. It was because some people were agree about slavery, and other people not, and it was about some states wanted to join the U.S. states, and it was question about who agrees with slavery or not.
Right. Okay.
Not? Yeah.
Yeah. So we looked at the 1820 Missouri Compromise, where there was all these territories. The territories were going to become states, the states we know now, and the Missouri Compromise brought in Missouri as a slave state and Maine up in the Northeast as a free state, and they tried to keep a balance between the slave states and the free states. But then they drew a line on the map at the 3630 line of latitude, I think. And they said, okay, everything in the future that's north of that line that becomes a state will be a free state. Anything below that line, south of that line, becomes a slave state. So Missouri Compromise, they drew a line on the map and they said north is free, south will be slave. Then jump to 1850, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and they say popular sovereignty will now decide if a new state coming into the country will be slave or free. Popular sovereignty, Nadia, like you said, is the people are in that state are deciding whether that state will be free or slave. And so Kansas was the first one, and it becomes crazy and violent because people were pouring into Kansas from outside Kansas in order to vote in the idea of popular sovereignty, whether it would be slave or free. So it was bleeding Kansas because it was very violent. First thing we're going to talk about today is somebody that we touched on last week, John Brown. So fast forward a couple of years, 1859, and here's a famous painting of John Brown. It was painted in 1950. Now, anytime you look at a painting, a historical painting, you got to think, when was it made? Photographs are photographs, they happened at that moment. But a painting, this is a painting of John Brown. He's the big guy with the beard. It's called A Tragic Prelude. It's a mural painted in the Kansas State Capitol building in Topeka, Kansas, and it was painted in 1940. So anytime you look at a painting of a historical person, I think you got to look back and say, when was this painted? What was the world like when this was painted? Right? Because it's really a historical document. So it tells you not only about John Brown, but it also tells you about 1940 and the people, and that, at least the artist's view of John Brown. So what can we see here? It's called A Tragic Prelude. What do you think? A prelude to what? Now, of course, also, we haven't read yet about John Brown. We're going to get to that in a minute. But what do you think this painting is about? A prelude to what?
The war.
The Civil War coming, right? We see the two flags.
Yep.
You see the Confederate flag, the Union, the United States flag. Two troops,
Yep.
soldiers on the ground in the gray and the blue. Probably recognize that from the Civil War. What's the feeling of this painting?
Chaos.
Chaos, right? You have a fire, you have a tornado, you have men with
Tornado.
guns.
One man standing. Almost like he's trying to get everybody's attention.
Right, he's yelling.
Trying to warn
What's in
them.
his hands? He's got a rifle and what we can presume would be a Bible. Okay, and John Brown was a very religious person, so I think that is a Bible. And he's kind of like trying. What's he doing between the two groups?
It looks as if he's trying to keep them apart
Yeah, it does. It does.
while stepping on somebody's head.
Yeah, I don't. It does look like that. I don't know if that's a detail that's on purpose or what. It does look like he's trying to break up the two sides, right? As
Correct.
what we're going to read about in a moment happens in the lead up, in the year before, 2 years before what would be the Civil War. Of course, again, they didn't know it at the time, but um, the John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, that we're going to read about, is one of the last big events that happens nationwide that really tips off the Civil War. Okay, so this painting's pretty famous. When you talk about John Brown, it's a famous painting. Yeah,
What's
it's
in
very.
his I'm sorry, what's in his left hand?
His left hand, I think that is the Bible, and actually it is. Yeah,
Okay.
it is, because if you look, in this picture, you can't really. Let me see if I can zoom in a little. You see the A. This is the Alpha and the Omega. That sign is kind of a horseshoe
Okay.
as the Omega. Of
Right.
course, from Christianity, God is the Alpha and the Omega. So that is definitely a Bible there. Okay.
Okay.
John Brown's an
Thank you.
interesting character. Yeah, he's an interesting character because he's very religious, and yet he used very violent acts in order to meet his goals. Now, he was an abolitionist. He wanted to abolish slavery, and he stood on Christianity to justify very violent acts. Last week we touched very briefly on the Potawatomi massacre, where John Brown and a bunch of his sons hacked to pieces with swords I think 5 men, like at night in their beds, broke into their houses as basically an act of terrorism. So that's something we're going to talk about at the end of this section, if we can get going here.
Mm.
He was a terrorist. He was a Christian terrorist, but he's anti-slavery. So we look back. Quite often we look back on him as a good guy, but I don't know, complex figure. So anyway, so let's jump in. We can take turns. This first section about John Brown's only one page, a couple of paragraphs, so we can take turns here reading. And as you go, if you have any questions, let me know. We'll talk about it as we go. So let's jump in. So I'll read paragraph 1. On October 16th, 1859, okay, the Civil War is going to break out in 1861. So this is this is about a year and a half before the Civil War starts. 1859, John Brown led a small army of 18 men into a small town of Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to instigate a major slave rebellion in the South. He would seize the arms and ammunition in the federal arsenal, arm slaves in the area, and move south along the Appalachian Mountains, attracting slaves to his cause. He had no rations. He had no escape route. His plan was doomed from the very beginning, but it did succeed to deepen the divide between the North and South. That's kind of our introduction. Okay. It kind of gives the ending. His plan was doomed from the very beginning, but it did succeed to deepen the divide between the North and South. Okay. Marcia, could you read paragraph 2?
Sure. John and his cohorts marched into an unexpected Harper Ferry and seized the federal complex with little resistance. It consisted of an armory, arsenal, and engine house. He then sent a patrol out into the country to contact slaves, collected servers' hostages, including the great grandnephew of George Washington, and sat down to wait. The slaves did not rise to his support, but local citizens and militia surrounded him, exchanging gunfire, killing 2 townspeople and 8 Brown's company. Troops under the command of Lieutenant Colin Robert E. Lee arrived from Washington to arrest Brown. They stormed the engine house, where Brown had withdrawn, captured him and members of his group, and then turned them over to the Virginia authorities to be tried for treason. He was quickly tried and sentenced to hang December 2nd.
Okay, so that right there is kind of the whole story. So it was not a it was a big deal, but it wasn't. When John Brown's raid of Harper's Ferry went down, it wasn't a huge undertaking. It was 18 people, several of his sons, and they stormed the federal arsenal, the U.S. Army armory. They sent out a couple of their own group into the countryside to gather slaves. They were going to start a nationwide rebellion. Okay, John Brown thought he was starting something big and great. He was going to steal American U.S. Army guns and ammunition and then distribute them to rebelling slaves across the South. But what happened was, once they got in this tiny little engine house, kind of like probably no bigger than a couple of small rooms, they were trapped, they were cornered, and after I think about 36 hours they were there, the Army troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel. Everybody always has trouble with that. That's Colonel, like the officer, Colonel Robert E. Lee. I don't know why. I don't know if that's French or what. Yeah, that's okay. Robert E. Lee arrived from Washington, D.C. to arrest Brown. They stormed the engine house, captured him. I think 2 of his sons died in this fiasco. Okay, that's October 16th. He was quickly tried and sentenced to hang on December 2nd. So like 5 or 6 weeks later, he's hung. He's executed. Okay. Now here's a famous painting, another famous painting. These are the 2 famous paintings of about Robert E. Lee. And so here's him being led out to go be hung. Okay. This also, and the title is The Last Moments of John Brown. I don't know when it was painted, but it shows him kissing a baby. He's in shackles, right? His arms are held back. He's in shackles. He's being escorted out to the gallows to be hung, but he's kissing an African American, we can assume, maybe, a slave woman's baby. Okay, he is an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery. So now we're going to read a couple of paragraphs about how he was loved in the North and hated in the South, or was he? You know, we're gonna read. That was the story that the South told themselves. The people in the North love this guy. Why do they love him? We're against him. But that may or may not have been the truth. Nadia, can you read paragraph 3?
Just a moment, please.
Okay.
Brown's strange effort to start a rebellion was over less than 36 hours after it started. However, the consequences of this raid would last far longer. In the North, his raid was greeted by many with widespread admiration. While they recognized the raid itself was the act of madmen, some Northerners admired his zeal and courage. Church bells pealed on the day of his execution, and songs and paintings were created in his honor. Brown was turned into instant martyr. Ralph Waldo Emerson predicted that Brown would make the gallants as glorious as the cross. The majority of Northern newspapers did, however, denounce the raid. The Republican Party adopted a specific plan condemning John Brown and his ill-fated plan, but that was not what the South saw.
Okay, thank you. So he was, there were people in the North that supported and admired him. Um, Brown was turned into an instant martyr. What's a martyr?
Man,
Yeah.
a martyr is somebody who takes on a position and the pains and the troubles that go with it.
Right.
And they normally are exalted to a higher, not standard, but recognition from other people, because there's something about that person who put themselves in that position. And my opinion would be
Mm-hmm.
that other people could not do or want to do or are driven to do. So that person takes their place.
Right, right. Yeah, they stand up for a cause of some kind. But I mean, in its most literal sense, it goes back to Christian,
Beyond Christianity. Mm-hmm.
yeah, Christianity. And a martyr is a person who dies for their faith. So if you look at John Brown in that light, he is a martyr. He believed in abolition, the abolition of slavery, and was, not was willing, but died for that cause. So yeah, sometimes a martyr, we think of a martyr as somebody who's suffering for some reason, but it literally means a person who dies for a cause. Okay, but it also says the majority of northern newspapers did, however, denounce the raid. They said you can't just, okay, this newspaper may or may not be in support of abolition, but you can't just raid army supplies and think you're going to distribute them to rebelling slaves. That's just chaos. You can't have that. So people in the North did stand up and say, that's not what we want. The Republican Party adopted a specific plank. It means like a specific belief, something they stand for, condemning John Brown. So the Republican Party condemned what he did. But it says, but that was not what the South saw. So Tolulope, can you read, this is the last paragraph in this section for us about John Brown. Can you read paragraph 4?
Yes. Southerners were shocked and outraged. How could anyone be sympathetic to a fanatic who destroyed their property and threatened their very lives? How could they live under a government whose citizens regarded John Brown as a martyr? Southern newspapers labeled the entire North as John Brown sympathizers. Southern politicians blamed the Republican Party and falsely claimed that Abraham Lincoln supported Brown's intentions. Moderate voices supporting compromise on both sides grew silent amid the gathering storm. In this climate of fear and hostility, the election year of 1860 opened ominously. The election of Abraham Lincoln became unthinkable to many in the South.
Good, thank you. Okay, so yeah, that word there is 1860 opened ominously. If something is ominous, it's very threatening and dark and mysterious. So yeah, the election year of 1860 is right around the corner here for them, and that the climate of fear and hostility is happening with an election year right around the corner. But this is interesting, and I think we see this today. People painting other groups with a broad brush and saying everybody on that side or that political party believes this and is this way, right? People in the South believed, even against a lot of evidence, that everybody in the North supported John Brown. How could you support him? That's terrible. He's a terrible person doing terrible things. And everybody in the North supports him. But that wasn't necessarily true. Sure, there's probably people, very loud voices admiring him and praising him, what he did. saying it was right and good to do. But there was plenty of others in the North who didn't support it, said we can't have that, that's chaos, it's violence. But the people in the South point to the North and say, all Northerners supported John Brown. And you see that today. You see people saying everybody in that group, all Republicans, all Democrats, all, you see, anybody, pick any group. Everybody is like this or believes this or doesn't like that or is against this or for that, and it's natural to feel that way, but I think we have to be careful about that. And so here's Southerners reacting to John Brown in a certain way. Okay. And you better believe that was used as people then talked about the election of 1860 coming up here. I'm sure that John Brown was mentioned in the South when they're talking about the election of 1860. So the election of 1860, now we can turn here. Let's jump to a map. It's going to be complicated. There are two main political parties emerging, the modern Democrats and the modern Republicans that we have. They haven't always been around, but they were then. And so this election of 1860 is really the election when those two parties that we still have today really emerged as the two solid big parties. But there was other parties, and we're going to see another party, the Constitutional Union Party, come in and get some votes, plenty of votes. And then the Democratic Party was split and nominated two different people for president. Democrats in the North nominated one person, and Democrats in the South nominated another person. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and so he's going to emerge as the only Republican, and so he benefits from the Democrats splitting their votes. So we're going to see how that happens, and touch on how there's echoes of that kind of thing that happens today. Okay, so they're going to meet. Now we're going to turn our attention to the election of 1860. Very tense. Think about all the things that we talked about with Kansas, was only a couple of years before this. John Brown's raid, everything. Things happening, and then also the rumors and the suspicions and the downright falsehoods people tell about each other happening. This was an incredibly tense time in America. But they still have to go through the motions of having an election. And so one of those things that they do, as we will do this summer, even under the craziness of the pandemic, is the two main political parties this summer will have conventions to nominate their party's nominee for president. So the Democrats do that and the Republicans do that here too. So we'll touch on that. So let me jump in. Paragraph 5. The Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina in April 1860 to select their candidate for president in the upcoming election. It was turmoil. Northern Democrats felt that Stephen Douglas had the best chance to defeat the Black Republicans. I think black here just means like dark and evil. Although an ardent supporter of slavery, Southern Democrats considered Douglas a traitor because of his support of popular sovereignty, permitting territories to choose not to have slavery. Okay, so let's look at that for a second. See how things change, because last week we talked about people in the South loving the idea of popular sovereignty, right? Because the states get to choose. They said that's great. Now they don't like the idea of popular sovereignty. They say, well, slave states should be slave states, period. So now you have Southern Democrats consider Douglas a traitor because of his support of popular sovereignty, permitting territories to choose not to have slavery. Southern Democrats stormed out of the convention without choosing a candidate. 6 weeks later, the Northern Democrats chose Douglas, while at a separate convention, the Southern Democrats nominated then Vice President John C. Breckinridge. So the Southern Democrats break away from the Democrats from the northern states, and the Democratic Party now has 2 nominees for president.
Hmm.
Okay. Marcia, could you read paragraph 6?
Sure. The Republicans met in Chicago that May and recognized that the Democrats' turmoil actually gave them a chance to take the election. They needed to select a candidate who could carry the North and win a majority of the Electoral College. To do this, the Republicans needed someone who would carry New Jersey, Illinois, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, 4 important states that remained uncertain. There were plenty of potential candidates, but in the end, Abraham Lincoln had emerged as the best choice. Lincoln had become the symbol of the frontier: hard work, the self-made man, and the American dream. His debates with Douglas had made him a national figure, and the publication of those debates in early 1860 made him even better known. After the 3rd ballot, he had the nomination for president.
Okay. Thank you. What in the first paragraph or the first sentence there, why does the craziness with the Democrats give the Republicans an advantage?
Because they split.
Right.
So now some of the votes will come from the Southerners.
Right. So if every Democrat, let's say the country is 50-50, but if every Democrat votes, if the Northern Democrats vote for Douglas and the Southern Democrats vote for Breckinridge, then neither of them gets 50% of the national vote. Whereas if 50% of the country is Republican, all 50% will go to Abraham Lincoln. So that was a huge advantage. The splitting, the division in the Democratic Party is hugely hurtful to the Democrats in this situation. So they nominate Abraham Lincoln, not a big figure. He was never vice president. He was never Secretary of State or anything like that. He had served a couple of terms in the House of Representatives in the early 1850s, and in 1858 he ran for Illinois senator and lost. So, people talk about, so this president or that president was unqualified and didn't have the experience. He was a surprise to become president. Abraham Lincoln did not have a very large amount of experience as well. He had been a representative in Congress a couple of years and had run for Senate and failed. So kind of a surprise. Nadia, could you read paragraph 7?
A number of aging politicians and distinguished citizens, calling themselves the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee, and a wealthy slaveholder as their candidate for president. These people were for moderation. They decided that the best way out of the present difficulties that faced the nation was to take no stand at all on the issues that divided the North and the South.
Okay, so then it says a number of aging politicians and distinguished citizens. It'd be interesting to know who they were, but they break off and form their own a new political party, the Constitutional Union Party. They were moderates. They weren't going to take a stand on the issues that divided the North and the South, meaning slavery. They probably just wanted peace and to avoid a war, and they wanted, I don't know how they thought they would proceed into the future without taking a stand on these issues, but they nominate another person, John Bell of Tennessee, a wealthy slaveholder. So now you have a third party. Okay. It says, we'll come back to this map in a second. It says, with 4 candidates in the field, Lincoln received only 40% of the popular vote, meaning the people's vote across the country, and 180 electoral votes, enough to narrowly win the crowded election. This meant that 60% of the voters selected someone other than Lincoln. With the results tallied, the question was, would the South accept the outcome? A few weeks after the election, South Carolina seceded from the Union. So let's look at the results. So does anybody have any, is anyone unsure, let's say, and I think the answer is probably yes, is anyone unsure about how the Electoral College works?
You mean the popular?
Yeah, popular vote versus the Electoral College.
It has confused me for a very long time.
Okay, so here's my 30-second explanation. So every state has representatives and senators, right?
Mhm.
And of course, every state has 2 senators, and the House of Representatives is based on population. That number, okay, on this map, Pennsylvania has 27, which meant they had 2 senators and 25 representatives. The number of people your state has in Congress is equal to the number of electoral votes your state has. Okay. Back then, California didn't have very many people, so they only had 4. Today, California has 54 or 55 electoral votes. Okay, it's pretty reliably democratic. But what happens is we vote in November, same thing this year. We vote in November, and then whichever party this year, it'll most likely, hasn't been finalized yet, but it'll most likely be Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Whichever party gets a majority in Pennsylvania, okay, we vote as a country. Within Pennsylvania, whoever wins, Trump or Biden, gets all of Pennsylvania's electoral votes. Okay, so it is not the president is not determined by popular vote across the country. Lincoln only got 40% of the popular vote. 40% of Americans voted for Lincoln. And yet he won because if you look at the states he won on this map, it's the red ones, the pink ones. It was enough electoral votes. New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio are big, must have had a lot of people. He racked up enough, you could think of them even as points, to win the majority of the electoral vote. So look at the top pie graph is the electoral vote. He won 59% of the electoral votes based on winning those states, within each state.
So basically, if he wins the electoral vote in Pennsylvania, my vote, your vote, everybody's vote, but that popular, which would be the people from the House of Representatives, right? He wins all of those, then he wins all the electoral.
Yeah, the president does not win on majority win across the country, but he wins it's majority within each state.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
It's a strange way to do it,
Isn't
and it goes all the way. It goes back to the Constitution. People today say, well, it's a dumb way to do it, and there's arguments for and against it. But anyway, it's the way we're doing it until somebody makes a constitutional amendment, which is of course very difficult. We're gonna keep going with the Electoral College. So the way it worked then, and if you look at, compare the popular vote versus the electoral vote. Douglas. So what happened? So look at Douglas. Okay, popular vote, he gets 29. That's nationwide. He gets 29% of the country's votes. That's second place. Douglas, Northern Democrat, gets second place in the popular vote. But then look at the electoral vote, the top pie graph, gets 4%, comes in a distant fourth place. What that tells us is that in the North, it was Douglas versus Lincoln. But Lincoln won all the states. But Douglas So Douglas lost all the northern states. Okay. He wins Missouri, and I guess New Jersey, it looks like, splits their delegates or whatever. But let's just generalize. He loses all of the North, but that doesn't mean no one voted for him. There's a lot of people in the North that voted for him, and there's a lot of the North is there's a lot of people in the North, a lot of population. So Douglas must have felt, really screwed by this situation because he won 29% of the country, but barely got any electoral votes. And that's the way the Electoral College works. It's interesting. Now, if you combine, let's look at the popular vote. Actually, let's look at the electoral vote. So how bad did the Democrats mess it up by split? Well, you have the green of the Southern Democrat, Breckinridge, gets 24% of the electoral vote, and Douglas up against Lincoln in the North, he only gets 4%. So really, even if the Democrats were united, they would still only have, let's say, 28% of the vote. They would still lose to Lincoln. They'd still lose to Lincoln. But then if it didn't help that the Constitutional Union Party was in there too. They messed it up too. So it's interesting. That's the Electoral College. People, there's pros and cons. There's reasons that we do it. Some people say those reasons don't apply anymore, like they did at the time of the writing of the Constitution 200 plus years ago. But it's the way we do it, So Lincoln is elected president. He received 0 electoral votes from the South. There is a map I want to check out where do I have that? There we go. Here's county by county voting in 1860. Lincoln is the red colors. Douglas is blue. Okay, so the whole North is red and blue. Breckinridge is green. He's the other Democrat. And Bell, the third party guy, is a yellow to brown. So it looks like Lincoln did not win any southern counties. I don't see any red in the South. So that doesn't mean 0 people voted for him, but it means zero counties had a majority Lincoln. So let's just generalize and say nobody voted for Lincoln in the South. Okay, and yet he becomes president. It puts the South in a pretty ugly situation because now they're part of a country that they did not, like, as a unit, the South did not vote for the person who ended up becoming president. So what's going to happen? Now let's get to part 3 here. The South secedes. To secede means to break away. This is a longer one. We may skip some things. Maybe we can get through it. So now, of course, the election is in November of 1860, and then he becomes president, as always, the following year. Back then it was March, now it's January 20th. They changed it. So he becomes president. Lincoln will become president on March 4th, 1861. Okay, but of course the election comes out, and now they didn't have the news to know, they didn't have election night results on the news, but presumably within a week or two, I don't know, a couple of weeks, who you find out who's going to become president. Okay, so it says the force of events moved very quickly upon the election of Lincoln. South Carolina acted first, calling for a convention to secede from the Union. State by state conventions were held, and the Confederacy was formed. The Confederacy, we're going to see, is the new country that the South wants to be a part of, or wants to become. It says within 3 months of Lincoln's election, 7 states had seceded from the Union. Just as Springfield, Illinois celebrated the election of its favorite son, Lincoln, to the presidency on November 7th, so did Charleston, South Carolina, which did not cast a single vote for him. It knew that the election meant the formation of a new nation. The Charleston Mercury newspaper said, the tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated. What's that a reference to?
The Tea Party?
Yeah, the Boston Tea Party that led to the revolution of the American colonies, rebelling against Britain and becoming a new country. So they're saying the tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated, just like those, the Tea Party and all the people, the colonists, broke away from England. Now they are now in the 1860 are going to break away from the United States. So that they viewed themselves like, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They said, we're just like them. We're standing up against a tyrant, something, we don't want. Okay. We'll come back to this map. Marcia, could you read paragraph 11? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. No, Tolu Lope. I didn't get you a second turn there. Can you read paragraph 11?
Yes. Within a few days, the two United States senators from South Carolina submitted their resignations. On December 20th, 1860, by a vote of 169 to 0, the South Carolina legislature enacted an ordinance that the Union now subsiding between South Carolina and other states under the name of the United States is hereby dissolved. South Carolina's action resulted in conventions in other southern states. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all left the Union by February 1st. On February 4th, delegates from all these states except Texas met in Montgomery, Alabama to create and staff a government called the Confederate States of America. They elected President Jefferson Davis. The gauntlet was thrown. How would the North respond?
Okay, thank you. So in all, there were 11 states that broke away, seceded from the Union, and became the Confederacy. That would be the South, the Confederacy, in the Civil War that's coming. Now, this article isn't going to talk about Fort Sumter, but Fort Sumter was the first battle of the Civil War, okay, in April 1861. So after Fort Sumter, when it was clear now the United States Army is in open, shooting hostilities with the new Confederacy, that made an impression on these other four southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and they joined the Confederacy after Fort Sumter. So there's a little bit of a distinction. These Deep South 7 just up and seceded, up and left the Union. Another 4 were convinced after fighting broke out. Okay. Now, the other thing that a lot of people don't realize in the Civil War, these other light blue ones you call border states, they are states that had slavery but didn't secede from the Union. They fought, their soldiers fought for the Union in the Civil War, but they are states that had slavery but did not ever choose to secede. Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, which had been a part of Virginia, actually they created a new state called West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. Okay, so that's the breakdown of the map of the Civil War. These Deep South states believed very deeply and seceded first, and then 4 more seceded after Fort Sumter. Okay, it says a few last-ditch efforts were made to end the crisis through constitutional amendment. Now this is interesting, and I'd like to discuss this a little bit. We'll see how far we can get here. I do want to be done. I try to stick close to noon here. Senator John Crittenden I forget where he was from, proposed to amend the Constitution to extend the Missouri Compromises, this is 1820, the Missouri Compromises 3630 line to the Pacific. So he wants to get that line back and say, let's go with that again. All territory north of the line would be forever free, and all territory south of the line would receive federal protection for slavery. Republicans refused to support this measure. Marcia, can you read paragraph 13?
Sure, let me find it. All right, here we go. On March 2nd, 1861, 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration, the 36th Congress passed the Corwin Amendment and submitted it to the states for rectification as an amendment to the Constitution. Senator William H. Seward of New York introduced the amendment in the Senate, and Representative Thompson Corwin of Ohio introduced it in the House of Representatives. The text of the proposed amendment is as followed.
Yeah, go ahead and
No
read.
amendment.
Yeah.
Okay. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere with any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of a person held to labor or service by the laws of said state.
Okay, thank you. So Crittenden proposes, hey, okay, let's just go back with the line, the Missouri Compromise line. North of that line, any new states will be free. And south of that line, any new states will be slave. We will lock in the southern right for slavery. And then Corwin, Senator Corwin or somebody, a Representative Corwin of Ohio, says not only that, but he tosses on one last amendment, the sixth. These are they're making constitutional amendments, and he makes a constitutional amendment that says no future constitutional amendments can ever touch this arrangement of slavery. It can never be undone. This law that they're making, the line for the 3630 line, north and south, the slavery in the South, it can never be touched, even through constitutional amendment. Kind of like, I mean, they're making a rule that you can never change these rules. You know, they're locking it in. Okay.
That's awesome.
Now, well, is it though? Because I think the Constitution, it clearly says, you know, you can amend the Constitution. I think the Constitution makes, you know, sets up a wonderful government, and they certainly thought it through, gave it a lot of thought. They did it for good reasons, certain reasons. But they said, okay, this can be changed in the future. And now they made a constitutional amendment very hard to do. You know, you got to pass it through Congress, and then it has to be ratified by conventions in every state or 3/4 of the state. But here's an amendment that says this can never be changed.
But see, there's a positive there because it's about racism, really, and slavery. So as long as it can never be changed, there will always be a portion, no matter what kind of chaos comes in the future, that people can go to an area and be safe.
Well, right, but the flip side is they're locking in, they're setting in stone that there will always be slavery in the South.
I see.
You know, so no, it's great that they're locking in stone that there will never be slavery in the North, sure, but like
Right.
they're I think. What do you think? And Nadia and Totolope, you know, we've talked about the founding fathers and the Constitution. How do you think they would think? Like, what would Thomas Jefferson and those guys who wrote the Constitution, what would they think of this amendment that says no future amendment can change this? What do you think?
And actually, I think it's not fair because people can be changed. And if no one can change anything in the future, but what if they were wrong? Like people after them
Hmm.
can have the different view. Uh, I would never put any rules like that. No one can change anything.
Right.
I think the forefathers would agree.
Yeah, they knew that the world changes. And even, you can talk about what did those founding fathers, what was their view on slavery? They weren't, well, plenty of them were slave owners, plenty of them. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner who was against slavery. Like there was a very complicated issue. But um, and we've talked in this class about how they did prohibition in the 18th Amendment. They prohibited alcohol, and then 10 years later they undid that with the 21st Amendment. So no, the beauty of the system is it can be changed. It's very hard to change it, very hard to make a constitutional amendment, but it can be done if the American people believe strongly enough in an idea, it can be amended into the Constitution. But this guy here says, we'll just never change it. Now, I think, now this is of Ohio, presumably this guy from Ohio was not a big fan of slavery, but I think if we can say, give him the benefit of the doubt, his goal wasn't, he didn't love the idea of locking in slavery forever. But I think what he was trying to do was give the South something to compromise. This whole situation is called the Crittenden Compromise. Okay. Crittenden was the guy who first proposed this idea. Corwin comes in and says, oh, let's lock it in forever. I think what he's trying to do is saying, hey, South, we're going to give you this. You can have slavery because what would let's put ourselves into this guy's shoes. Slavery in the South, let's say he was against it. What in his mind is worse than that? What was he trying to prevent?
A complete civil war.
Everything blowing up and falling apart in a complete civil war. So the Crittenden Compromise and the Corwin Amendment, I don't think Corwin is saying, hey, I love slavery, let's make it forever. I think what he's saying is, we'll give this to the South. They're obviously freaked out about slavery, and they've been showing it for decades there. Let's do this, or else we're going to have a big problem. It says this is 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration. Obviously, these people knew 7 states had already seceded, right? The country is actively falling apart. Like they're seeing it in their newspapers. The people, if you live in the South, if you live in, anywhere, 7 states have already said, we are done with America. We are not part of it. We are a new country. So here's Congress saying, hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Let's just give it to them,
Let's throw the dog a bone. Yeah.
Yeah, and just like, it's not good. We don't like it. It's a compromise. This America, especially congressional history, is full of compromises. You do something you don't like to avoid something that you hate, Now, bottom line is, it doesn't pass. It says the amendment failed to get the required approval of 3/4 of all state legislatures for a constitutional amendment, largely because many of the southern states, slave states, had already seceded and did not vote on it. Now, they could have come in, actually, and said, yeah, okay, we'll take that deal. And they discussed it, I think, in the South. But they said, no, we're done. We're out. We're not part of that anymore. We're not going to vote on that because we're not part of that Congress. The Civil War is really interesting because you have the people in Washington, D.C., in Congress, still running a country. Lincoln viewed himself as the president of the United States, which in his mind included the original Southern states, right? He in Lincoln and everybody's mind in the North and certainly the Union Army, they're fighting to keep the country together. It's like if if your teenage son or daughter says, "Oh, I'm sick of your rules. I'm going to leave. I'm going to be, I'm going to move out, essentially become my own family." And then you as a parent say, "No, I understand we have our differences, but you're a teenager. You can't just move out. You can't be your own family. That, I'm not going to let you secede from this family, right?" So you're trying to hold your family together. The teenager is trying to leave the family. Same thing with Lincoln. Lincoln says, I'm not going to let you leave this country and become another country. So they fought a civil war to make it happen. But Congress is still meeting. I presume there's empty seats where the Southern senators used to sit and where the Southern Southern representatives used to sit in Congress. They're still moving on as if Congress is still and it was a fully real thing, but there's no senators or congressmen from the South to vote, but they still viewed them as absent, not, disappearing. So last paragraph, it says, what was the president doing during all this furor? Abraham Lincoln would not be inaugurated until March 4th. James Buchanan presided over the South's exodus from the Union. Although he thought secession to be illegal, he found using the army in this case to be unconstitutional. Both regions awaited the arrival of President Lincoln and wondered anxiously what he would do. Okay, now, I take a lot of these articles from ushistory.org, which is like an online textbook. The next article is about, I think, about Fort Sumter and how it was the first battle of the Civil War. Lincoln always had that attitude like, no, I'm not going to let you break away. I'm not going to let you secede. You can't do that. I guess they've been trying to work out their differences for decades here. And they failed, and the South said enough is enough. But it's just a really interesting time. And as we look, I think this election this fall is going to get ugly, and we're all going to say this is the worst thing ever. But think back to the 1850s, the election of 1860. Unless things go really haywire here in the next couple of years, I always look back, and I talked about this last week. There have been far worse, far more chaotic times in American history. And I think the election of 1860 was crazy. As a direct result of that election, we get the Civil War. So, it was crazy. Okay. Any questions about that? Or comments? It was a really interesting time. Any questions or comments?
No, thank you.
I have one. So they didn't get to lock that amendment in, is what you're saying. But the South basically said, no thanks, we're done with this.
Right. It didn't pass, didn't happen.
Because I got your point of view when you said, yeah, but it locks in slavery in the South. And I wasn't thinking like that. What I was thinking was, well, if we ever had another upheaval of such a degree, well, then there would be a safe place for people in the North. But I guess, flip side of the coin.
Yeah.
So that's good. Good it didn't get locked in.
And it's interesting because you think, well, they were trying. It was a last-ditch effort to try to avoid a civil war, but it'd be interesting to maybe somebody's written a historical book or something. What would the country be like even today if that had passed? How would history have played out? They would have avoided a civil war, but that means slavery would be locked in. What if this, I can't imagine we'd have slavery of African Americans today. The world would move on, but how would we have gotten rid of it if it was written into the Constitution unchanged?
Right.
It'd be. Interesting. So, that's a really interesting what if in history. History's full of those, but that's a real one. Um, you know, but it didn't pass. Enough people thought that, hey, that's a bad idea, that it didn't pass, and so because of that tension was not relieved, we break out into the Civil War. So, all right. Well, hey, there's lots of good. I mean, people love to study the Civil War. There's plenty of good opportunities to learn stuff, specific things. As I said last week, I like to talk about the themes, general ideas, not generals in the army necessarily, but the general ideas. What was it like? What did it feel like to live through this? And of course tie it back to today, because it's been a tumultuous several years, and people say things are getting better or things are getting worse. But I mean, if you look back, if you have a historical perspective and can say, well, this thing happening in the news is like this thing that happened in 1850 or 1860. I think that has value to us as citizens. So
Well,
thanks
we don't
for
want to keep repeating it.
yeah. Right, yeah. So thanks for logging in. I appreciate it, Marcia. I'm glad to have you join on. I will send out an email later with this recording if you want to rewatch it, of course, and this reading. I do encourage you to look this over again. Always read it a second time. It's always really helpful to learn. Um, and maybe I'll see what else I can find maybe to share about this topic. Okay.
Is it possible that you can send me what I've missed in the
Yeah,
email?
what I can do, I mean, the easy thing is when I upload this recording to YouTube, I put it as part of a list. And so
Okay.
in that, I don't know how it would really look on your end of things, but I put it in a list. And so that should be in a list. Like you should be able to scroll back in YouTube and see, once I share this link, you should be able to see like last week's class and the week before
Okay.
that. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Yeah. All right, ladies. Well, thank you. Have a great week. Thanks for logging in.
Thank you. You
Yeah,
also.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a wonderful week.
Yeah.
Bye.
See you,
Yeah.
everybody.
Bye-bye. You too.